Okay, I refuse to believe this is the best the third largest market in the U.S. can do for a soccer game. And keep in mind, I say this as a Fire supporter. The MLS expansion discussion is a never-ending one. We ask questions like, which city is next? And how many teams is too many teams? And also, is it better to keep expanding or to work on bettering the current markets? But here on the Danny T Radio YouTube channel, I seek to answer the questions that no one asks for or care about. And today that question is, which existing MLS markets, if any, could host another MLS team? So unofficial criteria for this list, first and foremost, being market size. And I don't have a magic number of what's considered too small of a market, but I'm looking at radio market rankings, and I'm generally hovering around that top 10 market range. And by the way, the reason I look at radio market rankings versus just straight up population for a city is because the radio market rankings take into account the surrounding area of the city. So if you live in the next town over, you still get lumped into that city. Another piece of criteria that I have to look at is fan potential, because maybe a market is big enough, but maybe there wouldn't be enough fans to be able to support two different teams. And finally, would the city be able to realistically find another place to play for this team? Before I begin, remember, if you're a fan of MLS or just curious to find out more about the league, please subscribe for more MLS content. All right, so first, let's just knock out the easy ones. Nashville's too small, San Jose's too small, Columbus is too small, Kansas City's too small, Cincinnati, too small, Austin's too small, Orlando's too small, Salt Lake City's too small, St. Louis is too small, Charlotte's too small, Portland's too small, Denver's too small, and Minneapolis, too small. Okay, now I've never actually worked in radio in Canada before, but I believe the metrics are still measured the same way. And I haven't read anything online to tell me otherwise. So, Vancouver sits at about 2.4 million people. That would put it around market 22 in the United States, so that would be too small. Now, Montreal, on the other hand, sits at just over 4 million people, and that would place it around market 12 in the US, which is like right on the edge. I can see how some people would make the argument that it's not large enough to be able to host two MLS teams, but I'm a little tired of saying the words too small, so I'll allow it. I'll say Montreal qualifies. And Toronto, well, Toronto's huge. They got almost 6 million people. That would place it around market 6 in the US, so yeah, Toronto easily qualifies. Wow. Okay, so already 14 of 27 markets, it's already over half the MLS markets, have been wiped out for being too small. Now, even though we don't have a 28th market yet, aka Team 30 in MLS, it is believed that that market will either be Las Vegas, Phoenix, or Sacramento. They can find an owner willing to pony up the cash. And I would argue that all three of those markets are too small. So next, let's look at Atlanta. Because for me, this is the next easiest market to cross off the list. Now, you might be thinking, Atlanta, that's market number 8. I mean, they're big enough, obviously, and clearly they have enough soccer fans in the city. I mean, they own virtually all of the MLS records. How in the world can Atlanta not host another MLS team? Yeah, actually, those attendance records is exactly why I say no. Because Atlanta is taken. United already own that city. I mean, if you're a soccer fan living in Atlanta and you haven't bought into MLS yet, if Atlanta United can't do it, then no one's going to be able to do it. Now, even though Atlanta hasn't been quite as dominant since Tata Martino left, I just can't imagine a world where another team comes in and steals fans from Atlanta United. Like, no, it's not happening. And you know what? I'll use the same exact logic for Seattle. Like, Seattle, another MLS team in that market? Not happening. Because if you live in Seattle, you are Sounders till you die. Like, there is just 0% chance another team can come in and be successful in that market. Okay, so I got rid of the easy ones first. And for these last 11 markets, I really wavered back and forth whether another MLS team can coexist in the market. So I'll go through them all one by one, starting small and working my way up. Montreal. I'll say it. Impact supporters were underrated. I mean, I've been to Stade Saputo a lot of times, and every time I went to that stadium, the atmosphere was awesome, and the supporters were loud. That was the Impact, though. Now there's CF Montreal. Yeah, if memory serves correctly, there was a lot of fans really pissed about that move. Pissed enough to stop supporting the team? Seems extreme, but fans do that. I mean, think about it. There's a lot of MetroStars fans that didn't convert over to Red Bulls fans. Do we see the same thing with Montreal? I mean, we can't really tell yet because with this pandemic, Montreal is still allowing limited attendance in their stadium, so we haven't really truly seen how the name change has affected the fan base. Now, the stadium is called Stade Saputo, named after the guy that founded the team, Joey Saputo, and I hardly think he'd be okay with welcoming another team into the stadium named after him and his company. However, there just so happens to be another viable stadium right down the road, an Olympic Stadium. Now, if they upgrade the turf and put a fresh coat of paint on the seats, that could definitely be a full-time stadium in my eyes. So, Olympique de Montreal? Yeah, I could see it. Montreal, I will say yes, they can host another team. Miami. You know, believe it or not, I bet there are actually people out there that are turned off by David Beckham and the whole pink and black color scheme. But it took a long time, like an obnoxiously long time, to get a stadium secured in Miami. And even if a new team were to come in and want to play their games at DRV Pink Stadium, I don't think that would happen because the stadium's been bedazzled with pink and black seats. They would have to rip up all the seats and put in either neutral colors or colors of the new team coming in. Yeah, I just don't see it with Miami. I know theoretically they probably could go play in a college football stadium or the Miami Dolphin Stadium. I just don't think Don Garber wants to go with that. I mean, if you're going to go play in a football stadium, that's like the extreme example. So, Miami, I'm going to say no. New England, or in this case, we'll just call Boston. Hey, if the New England Revolution were to move into a stadium downtown, then this one's easy. It's obviously no. Let's look at this through Robert Kraft's point of view. I mean, if you think about it, his current stadium situation's pretty convenient. I mean, he owns both the Patriots and the Revolution. It's not like he has to pay rent for the Revolution to play in the stadium. And maybe he just doesn't think it's worth it financially to build a whole nother building for this team. And I know he pledged to pay $400 million of his own money to build a stadium. And I know they said they're working on it. And I know they've been looking, but it's been 25 years, okay? I'll believe it when I see it. Boston is a fantastic soccer city, but there are people out there who refuse to follow the Revolution simply because of the branding. I've met them, and I think they're wrong. Personally, I don't like the crayon flag, but I think the Revolution name is awesome, and people should totally get behind it. And maybe those people just want to support a team with a more traditional European-sounding team name. Now, I have no doubt that the Revolution diehards would still exist, but if an eccentric Boston billionaire were to approach Don Garber and say, yeah, you know what? I will build that stadium in Somerville or Everett or wherever. Might be hard for Don Garber to say no. Boston Athletic? Perhaps. So yeah, I'm going to say yes, Boston can host another MLS team. Philadelphia. It's a tough one because, yes, they do have a soccer-specific stadium, but it's all the way out in Chester, which is a good 20 minutes away from downtown. Not the absolute worst stadium location in MLS, but there's definitely better ones out there. Now, according to the National Apartment Association, Philadelphia has been listed as the 6th hardest city in America to build an apartment. Side note, according to that same list, Boston is listed as the 2nd hardest city. So, okay, maybe Robert Kraft does have a reason as to why he hasn't been able to build a stadium yet. But anyways, hopefully you know where I'm going with this. If it's hard to build an apartment in a city, I'd imagine it's probably pretty damn hard to build a stadium, especially if you already got one. I mean, try convincing the mayor, the voters, to pay for more taxes to build a second soccer stadium. I just don't see it. So Philadelphia, I'm going to say no, they can't host another MLS team. DC, nope. No, hard no on DC. Because, you think about how long it took to build Audi Field. That just tells me that they're not going to be able to build another stadium, in downtown DC. And I could see the argument being made, well, maybe you can share the stadium. Because, it does kind of have neutral colored seats. But then you also have DC United painted on one of the sides. So I tried to come up with reasons as to why you maybe could have a second team. I just couldn't come up with any good ones. So this one's pretty easy. DC United, or DC as a market, cannot host a second MLS team. Toronto. Now, DC was easy for me. Toronto, on the flip side, is probably the hardest market for me to decide. Because on the one hand, they already have a gorgeous downtown stadium, and they do really well filling it up. They're usually top 5, 6 in attendance year after year. But can we really say that it's like Atlanta or Seattle, where if another team were to come into the market that no one would leave the TFC fan base? I mean, maybe people just aren't really happy with them right now. I mean, maybe they want a team that represents Canada more. I mean, if you think about it, there's as many Americans on the roster as Canadians. But it's the same problem that I have with a lot of these teams. I mean, where would they play? Would Toronto FC really share the stadium for them? Or would they be able to find a new place to play? I don't know. It's close. It's not a slam dunk either way. I've gone back and forth. I've rewritten the script more than once, leaning both ways on this one. But ultimately, I'm going to say no. I don't think Toronto can host another MLS team. Houston. Let's not sugarcoat it. H-Town is struggling with attendance issues right now. And not that they're the only team that wants to put more butts in the seats, but Houston already has a prime downtown location for their stadium. Yeah. It's a little cause for concern. By the way, anytime I comment on an attendance issue, I'm not blaming the fan base. You will never hear me say a team has a bad fan base. When attendance isn't up to par, I think that falls mostly on the front office. And I've talked to Houston fans. The reality is that this team does not market itself the way they need to within the city. Add in the fact that they've been really inconsistent for this past decade, and they've had few household names with fewer big-time international superstars. That's just a recipe for losing attendance. Now, the good news is they did get a new owner, and I think the situation is fixable. But it ain't getting fixed if you're throwing a shiny brand new team into the city. If there's one team, one MLS team that cannot afford competition within its own market, it's the Dynamo. I think if you do that, there's a really high probability, good chance that the Dynamo might become totally irrelevant if they don't fix their current issues, and I just don't see a reality in which two MLS teams can survive in this market. So I think the play is you got to fix the Dynamo before ever throwing in a new team in the market. So Houston, I'm going to say no. Dallas. Okay, nothing against the people of Frisco, but if they could do it all over again, I'm not sure MLS and FC Dallas would build a stadium 30 minutes away from downtown Dallas. And yeah, like Houston, Dallas at times really struggles with attendance. But there's one thing that Dallas has that no one else in MLS can touch right now. And that's their academy. Okay, I know it just seems like I'm pulling random reasons out of my butt, but let me explain myself on this one. Yeah, other teams have academies and USL teams, but none of them are touching Dallas right now. I mean, FC Dallas has produced guys like McKinney and Tessman and Reynolds and Che and Cannon and Pepe and Pomical. And that train ain't stopping anytime soon. They are just a factory of producing talent in this country. Now, if another team were to come to Dallas, I have no doubt in my mind that FC Dallas would take a hit in their attendance. But I don't even think they really care about that right now, because their academy has built such a rock-solid reputation that I believe that even if there were 2 Dallas teams, a lot of kids would still choose to go to FC Dallas simply because of the history of their academy. So, Dallas City, there'd probably be something stupid and generic like that, right? Dallas City, I could see it happening. Dallas, I will say yes, they can have another MLS team. Chicago. Yes. Easy yes. The easiest yes on this list, because, SeatGeek Stadium is already out there if they wanted to move into there, or if they wanted to play their games at Soldier Field and share it with the Fire, that's also out there. Yeah, neither of those options ideal, but those options are out there. And now the Chicago Fire are trying to build a downtown stadium. Since it hasn't been built yet, they can build it with both teams in mind, meaning they can share the stadium if it ever does get built. Now, the only downside that I can really see is the same with Houston. If another team comes into the market, can the Fire really be able to survive and compete with them? The Fire crown did a lot of damage, and so did sucking for an entire decade. The good thing is that they're ditching the crown and going with a new badge, one that's not universally hated among all the fans, and they're making a conscious effort to go younger in their roster. Call it blind optimism, but I still believe there is potential for this group to get better. Now, you had the Chicago House come in, and ultimately they didn't even put a dent into the Fire fan base. I know that's NISA, a whole different league, but I was a little worried at first, but not anymore, because the Fire diehards still showed up at Soldier Field. And now that you have a badge that's not a stupid freaking crown, and if the team actually starts to win a little bit, I have no doubt in my mind that the fan base will start to come back. One of the original names they tossed around before ultimately selecting the Fire was Chicago Rhythm, and actually I always really liked the sound of that. So yeah, we'll say Chicago Rhythm's the new team name. Yes, I do believe Chicago can host another MLS team. Los Angeles. Okay, well, if there are 6 teams from London in the EPL, you'd have to imagine that LA could at least have 3 teams in MLS, right? Well, after some extensive research, I've actually discovered that London is in fact not a part of the United States. Yeah, even though LA is a big enough city to have a 3rd MLS team, the reality is that there's already a million other sports teams in the city. I mean, 2 football, 2 basketball, 2 baseball, a hockey team, and 2 soccer teams. And even though LA Galaxy and LAFC are pretty well supported, I just don't see a 3rd MLS team fitting into this equation and being well enough supported in this league. So I'm going to say no, LA cannot host a 3rd MLS team. And finally, New York City. Well, I could probably just copy and paste the same thing that I said for LA. I mean, yes, it's big enough to hold a 3rd team, but there's already a million other sports teams in that market. I just don't see how a 3rd team would be able to fit in. And you already add in the fact that it's impossible to build a stadium in downtown New York. I mean, how long have we had to watch New York City play at Yankee Stadium? But you know what? That's kind of a boring way to end this video, right? So I'm not going to say no. I'm actually going to say yes, with an asterisk. Yeah, I think the only exception in which New York City can have a 3rd MLS team is if that team is the Cosmos. Now, the Cosmos owner, Rocco Commisso, turned down MLS because he didn't agree with how the league was set up. In other words, he didn't like the fact that there was no promotion relegation. He didn't like the fact that there was an expansion fee. So, yeah, he would never willingly join MLS. But what if he were to sell the team to a billionaire who then turned around and said, hey, Don Garber, I'll pay the $500 million expansion fee or however high it would be to join MLS? I don't think Don Garber would say no. I don't think he cares that there's not a viable stadium situation in New York. I don't think he cares that the Cosmos recently went on hiatus in NISA. Reality is that the Cosmos brand is still a very attractive one, and I think Don Garber would love to have it in MLS. You know what? Part of me really wants to see that, because there's a lot of Cosmos fans that talk a lot of crap on Twitter. They hate this league. And it would be really fun to see the existential crisis they go through on whether they want to continue supporting this team in a league that they hate. Okay, so just to recap, the markets that I think could host another MLS team: Montreal, Boston, Dallas, Chicago, and New York City if it was the Cosmos. And out of all of those markets, the only one that I think has a sliver of a hope of potentially joining MLS would be Chicago. And even that's a long shot, like an extremely long shot. Which kind of renders this whole video pointless, but whatever. Still a fun little exercise for me. But what do you think? Do you agree or disagree? Do you think there is another market that could host another MLS team? Let me know. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.